Well, welcome back, folks. Today we're going to talk about off-season storage, or in my climate we normally call that winterizing. I was recently putting away several different pieces of equipment, and it dawned on me that some folks might not have a given process that they use to winterize or store their equipment for the off-season. This video is really made for those that are either newer to the hobby of vintage motorcycles or really don't have a current protocol that they use to winterize their equipment. So that's why I'm making this video today. Now, my intent here is not to try to convince someone to do something different than they've always done, or the process that they've developed themselves over the years for their own equipment. Use what works for you. I'm simply sharing with you what I do and some of the materials or products that I use. I'm not trying to sell anyone anything. I'm not trying to convince you to change products. Nothing of the sort. Rather, this is just how I go about the process. There is one primary product that I use to treat my fuel, and this happens to be the Stabil brand. You notice it's blue, not red. That's the marine version. Allegedly, it's designed for damp or wet environments. I live in the Great Lakes, so this is readily available because there's a lot of boats, outboard motors, etc. And this is very commonly used in my area. There are other fuel treatments out there. I know there are others that some people swear by, and it's a little bit like religion and politics when it comes to fuel treatments. It can get emotional for people, and use whatever works for you. This just happens to be the brand that I've used for years and have had good luck with. One caution on using any fuel treatment: don't overdo it. Follow the directions on the back of the bottle or can or whatever the container is, and treat it to the manufacturer's directions. I have found through many years, and again, I've been doing this kind of work for 50 years now plus, actually well over 50 years since I was just a little kid. And I have discovered that, if you follow the manufacturer's directions, it'll be perfectly fine, but if it says use an ounce, use an ounce. This is one of those times that if some is good, more is not necessarily better, because it will actually gum up your fuel system. And I could relate stories to you of gummed up fuel system because people put in way too much of whatever their fuel treatment was, whether it's Stabil or another brand, and they've had problems on the road. So follow the manufacturer's directions and you'll be fine. If you deviate from that, you're on your own. Another product that I have used occasionally, I don't use much anymore, is a fogging oil. This again is Stabil brand. You can see it, I think, right there. It's a fogging oil usually used on two-stroke engines. If I was to do a long-term storage, in other words, put a two-stroke engine away, or probably any engine for that matter, but a two-stroke for years, multiple years, I might fog it. The intention or the use of fogging oil is you normally, with the engines running, you spray it into the intake system through, you take the air cleaner out, spray it through the carburetor or some form of that, and you fog it with this lightweight, it's a very thin oil to coat the insides of the engine. And often the engine will stall out in the process, and it creates that oil film on the inside of the lower end of a two-stroke, or the cylinder walls and valves of a four-stroke. Again, I don't use that anymore. From time to time I might, but typically I just put oil in the cylinder and crank it over, kick it over a few times, and call it good. Fogging oil is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with it. If you like using fogging oil, knock yourself out. I just don't use it much anymore, though I do keep a can of it around. The primary steps that I'm going to go through today, and I'm going to use my Kawasaki F6A125 that I rebuilt the clutch on earlier this summer as a model for the rest of this video coming up here in just a few minutes. But the basic steps that I go through are really the same for all equipment that I winterize or prepare for off-season storage, whether it's a two-stroke, four-stroke, chainsaw, string trimmer, pressure washer, lawnmower, motorcycles. The process is essentially the same. There might be some deviation, of course, if it doesn't have a battery, because I do remove batteries. A chainsaw doesn't have a battery, so you don't have to worry about that. But the process is basically I run the engine dry. I run it until it stops. I drain the fuel system as best I can, including drying the fuel tank. I want to get all the fuel out of the tank and the fuel system, if at all possible. I put oil in a cylinder and then turn it over a number of times to coat the cylinder, and if there's a four-stroke valve, etc. And again, there's just minor variations as we move along. I've already done quite a bit of my equipment this year. I have most of my motorcycles done. I have some of my small equipment done. I have not done the string trimmers. I have actually two of them. I haven't done the string trimmers and the chainsaw yet, though I'll be getting to those here real soon. As I'm shooting this video, I have a few things left to do with the chainsaw, and I'm not quite done mowing yet and trimming. Those will be the last things I'll winterize this year. But the process is really the same. Now, I use a recreational fuel that is a non-ethanol laced fuel. I've talked about this, I think, many, many times. And even with a non-ethanol fuel, I use this fuel treatment year-round. When I buy my fuel, typically in 10 gallons at a time, 10 US gallons at a time, I put this in the can before I pump the fuel into it at the local fueling station. And even with that treated, and with fresh fuel, and I replenish my fuel every 6 months. The old fuel that's 6 months old goes in my pickup truck, and then I replenish spring and fall or autumn. I still drain everything and run it dry. I have worked on way too many carburetors and small engines over the years, and had to replace fuel lines that have had damage, especially in the last decade or so, as we were seeing this ethanol-laced fuel. And I think the formula, the chemistry's changed on gasoline these days, so I still remove it, still dry the fuel system out completely, remove the battery if it has one, put oil in the cylinder, pump up the tires. If I've got tires like a motorcycle, I pump them up to usually 32 psi or pounds per square inch, just to make sure they're good and hard for the winter, and I wipe them down, make sure there's no dust or debris on them from riding around the yard, and then I tuck them away in my shop. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is if I am winterizing or off-season storage preparing a four-stroke, that is with gasoline, or rather oil in the lower end, and I typically would change my oil on an annual basis. I always change the oil in the fall or in the autumn, not in the spring. And the reason I do it that way is because I want to make sure that I get all the contaminants out of the oil that have incurred during the course of the riding season. Water vapor or moisture and acids are two things that will build up in your oil if you ride it, your motorcycle over the summer. I do not want to leave the moisture and the acid in the lower end of my engine, so if I do an annual oil change, I would do it now rather than in the spring. So I've got fresh oil when I'm putting the unit away. I will usually change the oil with fresh oil. I will turn it over a few times and or kick it through, if it's just a kickstart, to splash that oil around the transmission a bit and coat it with that fresh oil, and then I will tuck it away for the season. So I'm going to reposition the camera here after this long conversation or lead in. I'll position the camera outside, and we'll real quickly I'll take you through the steps of preparing the Kawasaki F6A 125 for off-season winter. Mid-October, it's a very nice day. It's a little touch on the cool side, but it's a very nice day to do this kind of work, this off-season preparation or winterizing. I have the Kawasaki F6A out in front of my shop in case I dribble any fuel. I try to avoid keeping fuel out of my shop if I can, as much as possible. In case I lose a little bit, then no harm, no foul. You can see I have already pulled the fuel line off the outlet of the petcock right here, and I've rigged up this temporary Tygon drain line that goes down into, you can see it just loops down and goes into a gas container of fuel or gasoline. That's the container this fuel originally came out of here a few months ago, and I first got this bike running probably 2 months ago or so now. This bike has not been run in probably 10 days to 2 weeks. That won't matter. I have first charged the carburetor. That is, I turned the petcock to the reserve position because I want to make sure the carburetor got fuel. I want to charge the carburetor because I'm going to run the engine in a few minutes, and I'm going to run the engine or the carburetor dry. First thing I'm going to do, though, is just drain the fuel tank. You could do it in either order. You can shut off the petcock, run the engine dry, then pull the fuel line off and drain it, or vice versa like I'm doing here. It doesn't really make any difference, but I'm going to go ahead and turn this petcock on and start draining the tank. I'm not sure exactly how much is in there. It's probably a couple liters worth, maybe a couple quarts kind of thing, half a gallon, something like that. So I'll turn this on and drain this, and then we'll once that's done, we'll start the engine and run it dry. You should have seen the fuel start to run through, and I'm just going to let that drain through. I do have the bike brought up as vertical as I dare, because the petcock here is on the right side. The side stand's on the left, and the bike wants to sit off to the left side, so I wanted to bring it up. And I used a couple of hockey pucks to do that, and the bike is very close to vertical. And I'll just let it drain out here. So we've got the fuel tank dry, or emptied. There'll be a little residual in the bottom, and we'll take care of that later. But you can see no matter which position I put it in, she's empty. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start the engine and run it until it quits. And then we'll move on to putting oil in the top end of the engine, and we'll pull the battery and finish cleaning out the fuel tank. So let me go ahead and reposition the camera, and I'll start it. So you can see I ran the engine till the carburetor was out of fuel. You'll notice I used the enricher lever as it started to stagger. And you can tell it was starting for fuel. I used the enricher to purge as much of the fuel through the carburetor into the engine as possible. This bike doesn't have a choke. It's really got an enricher lever which dumps additional fuel into the carburetor rather than restricting the air supply like a standard choke would do. But the result is the same. It enriches the charge going into the engine. So use the enricher. You can use a choke if your device or equipment has a choke, and do the same thing. I want to get as much of the fuel out of the carburetor as I could. Now, if I was really anal retentive about this, I could pull the cover here. Remember, the carburetor's behind that cover. I could pull the cover, pull the carburetor, and I could drain it. There's probably a little residual fuel in there, but I normally don't. This isn't going to be stored for years and years. I will be running it again next season, 6 months from now or so, maybe 8. I'll be starting it. It does have Stabil and non-ethanol fuel in it, so what's remaining in there will be fine. I'm very confident if I pull that carburetor next summer without running it and look at it, it'll be clean as a whistle inside. That's been my experience. So now we're going to move on to putting a little oil in the cylinder and kicking it through. I will turn the petcock off just for safety reasons, put the hose back on so I don't forget it in the spring when I put fuel in and have gasoline rushing through. So I'm going to put all the fuel system back together, turn off the petcock, and then we'll put a little oil in the cylinder. It's hot, so I got to be careful. Pull the spark plug out. I have a little simple oil can here with just regular motor oil in it with a little plastic piece of PVC tubing. I'll put that in the spark plug hole and give it a couple of shots of oil. That. Now, the key is off, by the way. I will kick it through with my hand a couple of times, carefully. I don't know if you can hear that turning over in there. And then I'll put the spark plug back in. At this point, I do tighten up the spark plug. I do not leave it loose, because I probably would forget it next spring. And then kick it through a couple of times again, just to make sure. You don't want to use too much oil here. If you overdo the oil, you will create a hydraulic lock situation like I talked about on my Kawasaki F11 earlier this summer, that I had a leaking oil pump down in here in that bike, and it dumped a bunch of oil, two-stroke oil, in the lower end. If you put too much oil on the upper end, you could create a hydraulic lock situation, and you could do some serious engine damage. If you think you've got hydraulic lock going on, just pull the spark plug out, leave it out, kick it through a number of times to allow it to clear itself. But this is fine. I'm kicking it through with my hand, and you can see it's not hydraulic locked. So we've got really the engine done. Now we're going to move on. We'll just pull the battery. Battery is very simple, very easy to get out. Unplug it, unhook the battery strap, lift the battery right out, and I'll put this over in my battery charging station. Again, I'll talk about that another time, not today though. But now we've got the battery out, and we can just tuck these wires away, and we got that part of it done. So really the mechanicals are done now. What I'll do is just put some air in the tires, 32 psi in both front and rear, do a quick wipe down, and then we'll be just about done with it. About 32 psi, close enough. Well, that's it really for my off-season storage routine. Again, a version of this I use on all of my small equipment, whether it's a motorcycle or a chainsaw. Drain the fuel system, run the engine dry. If it has a battery, I pull it, put it in storage. I pump up, in this case, the front and rear tires to 32 psi. I can adjust that in the spring, or next time I get the bike out next season to ride it, put it back in service. I'll wipe it down good, make sure it's reasonably clean, and I'll put it back in heated storage in my shop with either a blanket or an sheet over it to protect it from dust. Then in the spring, all I really have to do is put the battery in, refuel it, fill it with fuel, or put gasoline back in it, and it should start within a few kicks. There's one other thing I'm going to share with you that is relevant if you don't have heated storage. I'm fortunate, and I do have heated storage, but particularly with metal gas tank equipment like this little Kawasaki, if you're storing your equipment in an unheated space, a garden shed, a backyard shed, even a cold garage, it gets below freezing, I would take a different approach on the fuel tank. Rather than draining the tank, I would fill the tank, preferably with a non-ethanol fuel. I'd fill it right up to the brim. And then in the spring, you can either, if you use recreational fuel or non-ethanol fuel that's been treated with a fuel stabilizer, you can just ride the bike in the spring. I would still run the engine dry, by the way. I'd run the carburetor dry, turn off the petcock, run the engine dry, and then connect it back together and leave the petcock off. The reason I would do that for an unheated storage is condensation and rust on the inside of the fuel tank. I don't like, again, using ethanol fuels for a lot of reasons, but in this particular part of the conversation, if you have an ethanol-laced fuel, ethanol absorbs moisture from the air, and what will happen over time is through phase separation, the water will drop to the bottom of the tank. The fuel, which is less dense than water, will float on top. That's why sometimes, or quite often, you'll see old fuel tanks with rust along the bottom seams, because the water sinks to the bottom. And the condensation of a cold storage and heating and cooling cycles will create that condensation effect, especially with ethanol-laced fuels. If you use a recreational fuel, you probably we could start it and ride it in the spring. The fuel will be 6 months or so old, and you'll probably be okay. If you're concerned about it, you could always drain the fuel and put it in your car and be on your way also. But If you're using an unheated storage space, I would, rather than drain it, I would fill the tank, is the bottom line there, to try to combat condensation as best I could. Other than that, that's my routine. We'll call this video a wrap at this point. Any issues, questions, thoughts, drop me a note. Otherwise, as usual, thanks for watching.